December 24th, 1945. In the small Appalachian town of Fayetteville, West Virginia, George and Jenny Sodder, along with 9 of their 10 children, have just finished opening a few presents and are heading to bed. Around 1 a.m., thick smoke fills the downstairs. George jolts awake, grabs his wife, and manages to pull their 4 youngest children out into the freezing night, fighting through the flames that have already consumed the ground floor. Standing outside, George takes a frantic head count and realizes 5 of his children, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, are missing. They sleep in 2 bedrooms separated by a central hallway, and that hallway is currently a roaring wall of fire. George breaks a window to re-enter, slicing his arm open, but the smoke is blinding. He runs to grab his extension ladder to reach the second-floor windows, but the ladder is now inexplicably missing. He tries to scoop water to douse the flames, but the rain barrel is frozen solid. Desperate, he sprints to his commercial coal trucks, planning to drive one up to the house and use it as a makeshift platform to reach his kids. He turns the keys, but neither engine will catch. Both trucks had been driven and were working perfectly just hours earlier. The suddenly missing ladder and the synchronized engine failures turned a frantic rescue into an impossible one. George could only stand by, bleeding from his arm, utterly helpless as his entire home burned completely to the ground. While George was trying to scale the house, his oldest daughter Marion ran to a neighbor's house to call the fire department. Frantic, she picked up the phone, but she got 0 response from the local operator. A neighbor who saw the blaze drove to a nearby tavern to call. Still no operator. That neighbor eventually drove directly into town to track down the fire chief, initiating a slow phone tree alarm system. The fire department was only 2.5 miles away, but they didn't arrive until 8 a.m. By then, the Sodder home was a smoking pile of ash. When fire officials combed the rubble on Christmas morning, they found identifiable remnants of household appliances, but no trace of the children. No bone fragments, no teeth, and no flesh. Cremating a body requires roughly 2 hours at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees. The Sodder house was destroyed in less than 45 minutes. Despite this total lack of physical evidence, the coroner's office issued 5 death certificates just days later, attributing the deaths to fire or suffocation. The state police blamed the blaze on faulty wiring, but Jenny Sodder remembered a specific detail. When she woke up to the smell of smoke, the downstairs lights were still on. If the fire had actually started in the wires, the entire house should have been plunged into total darkness. George Sodder arrived at Ellis Island from Sardinia in 1908. He built a successful trucking business in West Virginia and became a respected member of the local Italian immigrant community. He also deeply despised the dictator Benito Mussolini and routinely argued with his neighbors about it. Those arguments made enemies. A few months before the fire, an irate life insurance salesman warned George, "Your goddamn house is going up in smoke, and your children are going to be destroyed. You are going to be paid for the dirty remarks you have been making about Mussolini." George brushed the threat off at the time. But weeks after the fire, a telephone repairman inspected the property and discovered that the family's phone lines hadn't burned down. Someone had climbed the pole and cleanly cut them 14 feet above the ground. Then, George's daughter found a hard rubber object in the yard. Jenny recalled hearing a loud thud and a rolling sound on the roof right before the fire started. George, familiar with military ordnance, identified the object as a napalm pineapple bomb. The accumulation of severed lines, the sabotaged coal trucks, and suspicious objects reframed the fire. The Sodders began to view the blaze as a tactical distraction for a kidnapping. The family hired a private investigator who discovered that Fayetteville's fire chief, F.J. Morris, claimed to have found a human heart in the ashes on Christmas morning. Morris admitted he secretly hid it inside a dynamite box and buried it at the scene. The investigator forced the chief to dig up the box. They took the mass to a local funeral director, who identified it as an unburned beef liver. Chief Morris eventually admitted he planted the liver in the rubble, hoping a discovery of remains would convince the family to stop their investigation. In 1949, the Sodders hired a pathologist to excavate the basement. This time, they uncovered 4 human lumbar vertebrae. The bones were sent to the Smithsonian Institution for analysis. The Smithsonian report found that the bones showed greater skeletal maturation than one would expect for a 14-year-old boy, making them too old to belong to the missing children. A woman in Charleston reported seeing 4 of the children at a hotel, accompanied by men and women who spoke rapidly in Italian and refused to let her near them. In 1968, Jenny received an envelope postmarked from Kentucky with no return address. Inside was a photograph of a young man bearing an uncanny resemblance to her son, Louis. On the back, a cryptic note read, "Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie, Ilil boys, A90132 or 35. George hired a detective to go to Kentucky, but the man disappeared. When the family pleaded for a new investigation, Governor William Wallace Barron wrote back, telling the Sodders their search was hopeless and that they should reconcile themselves to the deaths. Dismissed by the governor and ignored by the FBI, the Sodders were trapped. Without bodies, they couldn't mourn. But without official support, every sighting and every cryptic photograph remained a potential lead with no way to verify the truth. The ambiguity defined the rest of the family's lives. Jenny Sodder wore black mourning clothes every day until her death in 1989. She stopped leaving her property, eventually building a fence around the site where the house once stood. For nearly 40 years, the Route 16 billboard served as a landmark for the town. It displayed the grainy faces of Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, posing the same unanswered question to every passing driver. What was their fate? Kidnapped, murdered, or are they still alive? Modern forensics can explain why remains might vanish in a fire, but they can't explain the documented sabotage. The cut phone lines and the fire chief's deception turned a tragedy into an 80-year mystery that survived the last of the Sodder children.